Kennesaw, Georgia is a burgeoning community only a few miles north of Atlanta. But this humble city was once legendary. It is the site of one of the most daring wartime missions of the American Civil War. During Kennesaw's former incarnation as Big Shanty, its population varied according to how many Confederate soldiers occupied its training facility. Camp McDonald hosted thousands of Confederate soldiers en route to deployments throughout the South. The Lacey Hotel provided lodging and meals for travelers and railroad workers. Today, the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History is located in the same area that was once the hub of Big Shanty's activity. The museum's most sacred occupant is the star of Disney's The Great Locomotive Chase and Buster Keaton's The General. But this star is not made of flesh and blood, but rather of steel and steam. Rogers, Ketchum, and Grosvenor Locomotive Works built the General in 1855 for the Western and Atlantic Railroad. The W&A Railroad was among the most ambitious of its day. It helped connect the Atlantic Ocean with the Mississippi River by way of its section of nearly 90 miles of track that ran from Atlanta, Georgia to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Outside of the museum is a memorial to the General's most famous conductor, Captain William Allen Fuller. On April 12, 1862, Union spies stole the General while it rested outside the Big Shanty Depot. Their primary goal was to disrupt Confederate supplies bound for Chattanooga. However, Fuller's tenacious pursuit of his stolen engine helped to foil the Union's plans. Through the years, books and films have retold this popular Civil War story. In his film The General, Buster Keaton's Johnnie Gray added comedy and a love interest to this most serious of events. However, the real Johnnie Gray is far more interesting, even if he is less widely known. William Allen Fuller was born on April 15, 1836 in Henry County, Georgia, to William Alexander Fuller. He worked for the railroad all of his adult life and was commissioned captain in the Confederate Army on August 3, 1863. He is best remembered for his role in the Great Locomotive Chase. Captain Fuller died December 28, 1905 in Atlanta, Georgia. David Eugenia Fuller, or Baby as she was called, was descended from Harrison Fuller, William Allen Fuller's uncle. Harrison moved his family to East Texas, where the Fuller line continued to prosper. Eugenia Fuller's eldest daughter, Grace, an author and a schoolteacher, traced the Fuller ancestry to the Mayflower generation. She carefully documented this research in her book, The Mayflower Trunk. According to her research, Edward Fuller and his brother, Deacon Samuel, both arrived on the Mayflower. Edward Fuller died shortly after arrival, and Deacon Samuel adopted Edward's son, also named Samuel. A key link in Grace's theory is that Lieutenant Edward Fuller, whom she believes to be young Samuel's son, migrated to the Carolinas with the family's Mayflower trunk. If her research is accurate, then William Fuller is directly related to the Mayflower generation.
I wish I had known Captain Fuller. Of course, he died in 1905, 40 years before I was born. But I would have loved to have been able to talk to him. But I felt that, in a way, I did through my grandfather, because, of course, my grandfather was his son-in-law, and they were pretty close. And so I know I got about as first-hand as you possibly can get a story second-hand.
The Great Locomotive Chase, also known as the Andrews Raid, quickly became one of the nation's great Civil War stories. Books and later films retold this event. Captain Fuller was especially protective of the account.
Captain Fuller was a very serious person. He did not take criticism well at all, and if anybody would try to change the story or get something wrong, he was very quick to correct them, and not necessarily very politely. I mean, he, as I said, this was a very important thing in his life, and he lived it, and he was going to make sure that it was told correctly.
Railroad conductors were integral to the South's economic welfare, and this importance was amplified during the Civil War.
It benefited the North greatly because, again, they militarized the trains and the railroads right away, whereas the South, again, fighting over states' rights. Governor Brown of Georgia was vehement when Jefferson Davis said, you know, you have to give us so many trains, we need this kind of track for such and such a times, for troop movements and everything else. Brown said, like hell, you're not going to get my trains, you're not going to tell me what to do. We'll run our regular passenger runs, and then maybe you can use them after we're finished. And because of that attitude in the South, and during the Civil War, you know, you didn't get troop movements. You did, but it's just they fought it tooth and nail.
The Union believed this railroad to be a weakness and devised a plan to take advantage. In lieu of this mission's success, Fuller's definitive fame was attained on April 12, 1862. The Georgia-based Western and Atlantic Railroad was crucial for Confederate supply distributions and troop movements. Its rail line from Atlanta, Georgia to Chattanooga, Tennessee was especially important, serving southern cities as far north as Richmond, Virginia. Additionally, at various points along its route, it diverged to cities such as New Orleans, Louisiana, and Mobile, Alabama. In the spring of 1862, a focal point of federal strategy was to take Chattanooga, and from Chattanooga turn on Richmond, Virginia. Disrupting Southern supply lines was crucial for this plan's success.
Union forces were camped in northern Tennessee. Ormsby Mitchell, in charge of the troops stationed there, decided, since he was going to move on Chattanooga, that he was going to try to cut off the lines leading to Atlanta below that, because he didn't want troops and supplies coming up from Atlanta to break off and get into Chattanooga, which might cut into his raid.
This mission required a charismatic leader with an intimate knowledge of the Southern Railroad. James Andrews was a smuggler to the South and a spy for the North.
From what I understand, they were all given instructions to individually or in small groups find their way to Marietta and check in at hotels in Marietta by a certain date. It was actually supposed to be by April 10th, and the mission was supposed to be on April 11th. However, the leader of the group, James Andrews, decided that because there was certain things he didn't like, he decided to wait till the next day.
Andrews' decision to delay the starting date for the raid proved more costly than he could have known. After leaving Marietta, the general's next stop was at Big Shanty. In Big Shanty, the passengers and crew had 20 minutes for breakfast, which was served just across the tracks at the Lacey Hotel.
You got to realize why they picked Big Shanty, that's Kennesaw today. This was the only station along the line, all the stations, that did not have a telegraph office. Basically, all that was here was a hotel, eating house, restaurant, and a hotel for guests. And across the street, this is something that Andrews and the Raiders didn't know, was a Confederate camp for 4,000 to 7,000 men, and a training camp for Confederates.
While Conductor Fuller and the others were having breakfast, the Raiders seized the train.
Conductor Fuller heard the noise of the train and took off on foot to catch the train, ran for close to 3 miles, finally got a push car, not a mechanized car. This is a car you could push with a pole. And him and Jeff Kane, who was the engineer, and William Fuller and Anthony Murphy pushed the car up to a place just beyond the bridge at Allatoona.
The Allatoona Pass would later be the site of a significant battle as the Union made its way to Atlanta in 1864. The Clayton House, next to which the depot was located, can still be seen today adjacent to the famous pass. Making it through this narrow gap was no small victory for Andrews' raiders, as sentry posts atop the ridges known as star forts could have easily sounded an alarm and opened fire on the engine. Beyond the Allatoona Pass was the first significant target for the raiders, the Etowah Bridge. However, Andrews decided it was too risky to burn this bridge. Today, the stone supports for the Etowah Bridge can be viewed from nearby U.S. Highway 41. The remnant of the local ironworks, named Cooper's Furnace, is nearby. A direct rail line connected the furnace to this portion of the track. The train engine, Yonah, worked this spur and was pressed into service for the pursuit, which continued to Kingston, where Andrews was delayed. Fuller's party arrived in Kingston shortly after the raiders departed. Outside of Kingston, the raiders busted up more track, and Fuller's party pursued again on foot until they intercepted Pete Bracken and his southbound engine, the Texas.
Pete Bracken, I think, was the real hero. Pete managed to back the train up, get all the cars in the siding, drive it at top speed backwards, and catch the general all within, I think it was less than 90 minutes.
It's in Dalton where the raiders' mission is ultimately doomed. Having written a brief message about the general's theft and the raiders' identity, Fuller dropped off telegrapher Ed Henderson at the Dalton Depot. Henderson sprinted for the Dalton Depot and sent a telegraph message ahead to Chattanooga. The next significant part of the chase involved Tunnel Hill, located approximately 10 miles north of Dalton. Tunnel Hill's pre-Civil War depot is made from local limestone and is viewable from the museum. Down this stretch of road, which once was railroad track, is the famous tunnel. This juncture of the chase was perilous for both sides. The raiders knew they had only two choices: ambush their pursuers or get as far north as possible before the general lost steam. This old tunnel was an engineering marvel of its day. It's 1,447 feet long, and it was completed in 1850 for the Western and Atlantic Railroad. It was the first railroad tunnel completed south of the Mason-Dixon line. Had Fuller not maintained his pursuit, the raiders would have had time to damage the tunnel, severely crippling Southern transportation. Conductor Bracken of the Texas skillfully drove his train backward through this tunnel, which leaves no room for error. Because of Fuller's pursuit, the raiders did not have time to damage the tunnel. Exiting Tunnel Hill, the chase continued on to Ringgold. By now, Andrews' raiders were aware of the failure of their mission and realized that capture was possible. Once in Ringgold, the general began to run out of steam as Fuller and company's pursuit had denied them the opportunity for refueling. 2 miles north of Ringgold, the general came to a halt. Andrews and his men made a futile run for it.
The thing was, he waited a day. See, they waited that extra day and it rained. So that when they got to bridges that were supposed to burn, these things were soaking wet. And they didn't have anything to burn except wood from the engine. It's a wood-burning engine. And so there was no kerosene, nothing. They didn't have it. There was nothing in the boxcars. Now, this is one of those events where there's so many ifs. Originally, he was supposed to have been a shopkeeper going to Marietta to buy supplies to take north. Now, if only they'd have done that, loaded the car with bacon or kerosene or extra wood or water, this would have succeeded.
Andrews was the first to be hung. 7 of his Union volunteers followed. For their service, Union participants of the raid were the first to receive the Medal of Honor.
The feat of penetrating Confederate lines to capture the train took an awful lot of courage, and you had 22 men that had equal amount of courage with Andrews to take a chance, knowing that if they had been caught doing that, they would have probably been killed right there. And the fact of right across from the Confederate camp, I mean, that's just incredible what kind of bravery and ability it took to pull that off without divulging what they were trying to do.
In 1903, a marker was placed in the exact spot where the chase ended. This is where the chase ends, and where its legacy begins. Nearly 3 decades removed from the time of the chase, one aspiring art student became enthralled with this spectacular event. Wilbur Kurtz was born in Illinois in 1882 and was raised in Indiana. After attending DePaul University, Kurtz studied at the Art Institute of Chicago. His fascination with the Great Chase resulted in priceless research for future generations.
I had some great time with my grandfather, and I remember sitting in his studio on Penn Avenue in Atlanta, sitting on a footstool at his feet and listening to the stories. And I'd always been fascinated by history anyway, and all this did was just perpetuate that. And he was an amazing man, and I'm very glad I was able to know him. I only wish that I had been older back then, so that maybe I could have appreciated it more. I was 11, 12 years old, and while I enjoyed the history and everything, I would have appreciated it more had I been older.
How Kurtz became interested in the Great Chase and his subsequent research was also an adventure.
He was a student at the Chicago Art Institute, and he read an article in the Chicago paper that was written by Pittenger about the Great Locomotive Chase, and it caught his interest. A short time after, he came to Atlanta after he had already interviewed the last remaining raiders of the Andrews raid in the Illinois and Ohio area where they were living at the time. After he interviewed them, he came to Atlanta with the express purpose of interviewing Captain Fuller, and that's where he met Captain Fuller's daughter.
A young Wilbur Kurtz courted Annie Laurie Fuller for 5 years. His letters to her included original sketches on their covers, demonstrating the depth of his affection. One especially appealing element about Kurtz's paintings is their historical accuracy.
And he spent years documenting historically the chase from Atlanta all the way up to the end, up around Ringo. I mean, to the best of my recollection, he virtually has walked every inch, maybe not of the track, all the tracks, but certainly Kingston, Altoona Pass, Resaca, Tunnel Hill, and all of those areas involved with the chase. He knew them inside and out, and he talked to people that were alive. So he was able to compile a very factual recount of the actual Andrews raid.
Wilbur Kurtz's historical research about the Great Locomotive Chase and his painting's fidelity to the period's geography and landscape complement well his artistic talent and his love of trains. Next, we turn to another artist, comedian and filmmaker Buster Keaton. 1926 was a banner year for epic film production, and Keaton's film The General was no exception. It was the most expensive comedy feature up to its day. The film's most expensive scene cost approximately $42,000, an impressive sum in the late 20s. Keaton's attention to authenticity in regard to landscape and the train engines was not without its irony.
He wanted to make that film look as authentic as possible, and he really was putting it in the setting so that it would have documentary-like aspects to it. It's comedy, it's dramatization, artistic license, but he wanted to have that period look.
Keaton wanted to film on location where the actual chase had occurred. But the track gauge had been altered, which meant that he could not use his authentic period-style engines.
So they went to another place, which was closer to California, to get that particular period look, to make it more real than the real place itself. And they found that lumber companies were still using that size train and gauge.
The timing of Keaton's production coincided with a noticeable evolution regarding his character, complete with better-paying jobs and a top hat.
The character is going from working class to appearing in settings that are upper and upper middle class. So the kind of film that he was making was changing.
After reading William Pittenger's account of the Great Locomotive Chase, Keaton had found the perfect story for his new character.
The idea that an individual would become so focused and so dedicated to solving a problem that he would literally chase after a stolen train on foot, when the majority of us would say, just sort of watch it and stand there saying, oh my God. He appreciated the idea of someone defying the odds, being so dedicated to accomplishing a particular task that he would pursue this impossible journey and then succeed. Absolutely mind-boggling. So he saw a typical Keaton theme relative to that actual historical event.
Buster Keaton's treatment of the Great Locomotive Chase offers some alluring convergences between Keaton's Johnnie Gray and the historical William Fuller.
I think there's an interesting aspect of just being a person in one's time and in one's place in one's situation. There might be this feeling that everyone is driven by patriotism, which most people are to a certain extent. But there's also a question of how can the average individual doing his or her thing, dealing with day-to-day existence, have a really good understanding of all these larger things that are happening around us. So one of the fascinating things about the General is that Keaton's character, Johnnie Gray, is dealing with his own individual conflicts that have arisen largely due to the storm. And by doing his particular task professionally and very, very well, he suddenly rises to become a hero within that overall conflict. But that wasn't his motivation to begin with. His motivation was to deal with what he needed to do as an individual, given his responsibility in his place in society.
And so we return to Kennesaw, Big Shanty, Georgia, the scene of a daring theft where such marvelous creativity was employed and great courage, both north and south, was proved. This awesome engine will never again serve the South or drive freight for the Western and Atlantic Railroad. But within this hallowed space, its very presence seems to recall the pride and perseverance of the human spirit that conferred its infamy.
I remember in my father's den, of which I have the picture, it's the lithograph of the Locomotive General that was done by the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. And I remember that hanging over his desk in his den and just being fascinated by that engine, not knowing a whole lot about it, but just the engine itself was just captivating to see that piece of machinery.
One man's decision to chase down this engine made history. But for Andrews and his raiders, that history came at a cost.
He never let up. He was just about in sight the whole time once they got through Kingston, and Andrews didn't have time. He couldn't do anything but keep going till they finally ran out of steam, so to speak.
Ultimately, the Great Locomotive Chase, for all its glory and art, will always be a tragic event. And yet the raiders and the chasers, whose fates are forever tied to its central protagonist, the General, will always remain uniquely heroic.